Alright, well, hopefully no one gets triggered by the fact that this thing has a overlay that's really boomerish. But hopefully we're alive now. I'm not sure. What can you see? Can you hear, Josh? How are you?
I see that we're now live.
Alright, perfect. Okay, well... Wow, that was difficult. Alright, so as promised, bringing you this next installment of the history stream. Josh wanted to guest star, so here he is. We're using Discord, using Streamlabs, and we have YouTube. So if there's, just throw anything info in the chat. If there's any feedback issues, anything like that, let me know. But I have my old 100 Years War document that we'll be going through. I'll just be reading. Josh interject. I'll pause. Maybe bring up a topic of conversation. So just chime in if you got anything. If you want to put something in the chat, people who are listening. Just feel free to just feel free to chime in the chat, or Josh, feel free to chime in vocally. So yeah, that should about do it. Just feel free to. All right, so here we go. So the 100-Year War series, the Edwardian phase, and the background. So this will take place in the years 1314 and 1369. Just as a little background, when I wrote this, I was in school, really kind of bored with what was going on, and I was just sitting kind of in the back of the classroom, and just as a little background, when I wrote this, I was just, typed it out, just basically did my research on my own, and did some from memory and some credited source, so if I have anything, just correct me. So here we go. 100 Years War was a 14th and 15th century dynastic struggle between the Plantagenet dynasty of the Kingdom of England and the Valois dynasty of the Kingdom of France, and many allies on both sides during various stages. The war was fought over the succession of the French throne, as both dynasties believed to have a rightful claim on what was ostensibly the largest and most powerful kingdom of Christendom. The backgrounds and effects of this war, or rather series of wars, are deep and complex. Many heroes and tragedies were prevalent at this time, and the war would have a vast impact beyond merely the scope of the two kingdoms. Warfare and social views would change, as to a degree would religion. Chivalry and feudalism would decline, and France would be put on the path to absolutism. Now, Josh, you mentioned when we started the stream that you felt like this was one of the more important, how do I say, one of the more important...
I think it's the setup for everything that comes afterwards, up into the French Revolution, frankly. There's a lot going on at the same time as the 100 Years' War was going on. For instance, the fall of Constantinople happens the final year of the 100 Years' War. So it really is the age where we're finally going into the Rinascimento and that time period in Italy especially, but it lays the groundwork too for France to be involved in Italy. Essentially, it completely removes England from being a continental power, and it makes France the predominant continental power. Spain, of course, is kind of almost a superpower, but its power is a little bit different than in France's. And so what we have is a Franco-centric versus Hispano-centric conflict between the Valois and the Habsburgs that's going to be decided in Italy, and the 100 Years' War sets the stage for that. And that conflict, the Valois-Habsburg conflict, is going to define everything up into essentially the French Revolution in terms of the continent, because England wasn't a continental power ever after it lost everything but Calais in the 100 Years' War.
Right. And this is what we're basically going to dive into. So this first part, as you may have said, the English dominated the first part. That's just a little bit of a disclaimer. So if we have any Francophiles in here, just be warned. This first bit of this first bit of history is not flattering.
No, I mean, even France is divided at that time period between the Dukes of Burgundy and the French crown.
Quite right. Okay, we'll dive right into it. So the French and the English had been at odds for many years prior to the onset of the war. Certain petty squabbles affected this rivalry, but more serious clashes did emerge. The Kingdom of England, as it was understood at this time, was established in 1066. I'm sure everyone knows, if William, Duke of Normandy, landed at Hastings and defeated the Saxon King Harold, asserting his claim to the vacancy left by St. Edward the Confessor. Harold himself had defeated the Norwegian claim weeks earlier at Stamford Bridge, but William and Norman forces wrested control of England from the Saxons, who had paid in blood for the islands against the Nordic Viking invaders. Interestingly enough, despite his new position as the King of England, William the Conqueror was still the Duke of Normandy, and thus a vassal of the French king. It's very important. This was odd not only because William and his line were not only peers in the chivalric status of the French king and being the dynastic rulers of England, but William objectively commanded a more powerful force and had direct control of more lands than the French Capet dynasty.
Right, but is it even really that odd? And that's just, isn't that really just feudalism in its entirety? I mean, here's a good example, and this is more recent, but it's the same concept. The I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but the laïcité law, the secularism law in France in 1905, that is not applied equally everywhere in France, because certain parts of France weren't parts of France during the Concordat with Napoleon. It's the same idea with feudalism, right? So you had a Duke of Normandy who is supposed to be a vassal of the King of France, but he's also in his own right King of England, right? I don't think that's that exceptional in this time period. I mean, the Dukes of Burgundy, which is also contemporaneous with the situation, is similar, right? The Duke of Burgundy is the vassal of the King of France, but he is so powerful in his own right, and he has significant holdings within the Holy Roman Empire, and not within France specifically, that keeps him somewhat outside the orbit of Paris. And I think even too, I think the King of France at the time might have had some lands in the Holy Roman Empire, and certainly afterwards, like the French Comté and things like that, they did after, well beyond like the Duke of Alba and things like that. But the point being is that I don't think that situation is particularly unique, but it was in a situation where the Dukes of Normandy were so much stronger than normal, I guess you could say, peers, that it became relevant.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And when I say that, to people that might not be versed in like the nuances of feudalism, it might seem strange that someone who's technically a vassal, or who is a king, like one king might be a vassal of another. So that's just the disclaimer that I wrote when I was writing this. So,
yeah, and it's the 100 Years' War is not a situation that's going to resolve that particular issue. I mean, the nobility,
right,
was always going to be a problem with the French specifically, up into the Revolution. I mean, they were a problem as part of the Revolution as well. In a way that England kind of took a different route, mostly because of the Civil War, where England had this sort of, I wouldn't say democratized, but the nobility were certainly in a very different situation in England than they were in France, as a result of the conclusion of the 100 Years' War, where England was not only depleted in foreign wars, but it was depleted in domestic wars because the wars that rose, because it was removed from the continent. The English nobility, I guess you could say, sort of mellowed out in contrast to the French, whereas even Louis XIV during the Fronde was very much suspect to the whims of the nobility.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, we'll continue on. So the French kings and lords would occasionally chisel away from the English continental holdings, citing that the English king was the vassal of a French king, and often punish perceived or actual missteps of the English with seized territory, often while the English were distracted in securing their position in the British Isles, such as warring with Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Danes, Norwegians, or their own northern barons. Several key events occurred, none so infamous as that of the major French reclamation of territory during the reigns of Richard the Lionheart and then his brother John Lackland. Probably one of the worst epithets I can think of as far as English kings go.
Lackland?
Yeah, Lackland.
Yeah, well, John wasn't as awful as people make him out to be, but he also had to go up against Philip Augustus.
True. Philip Augustus was a titan of a king, if ever there was one. So, anyway.
Also, he had to follow Richard, who,
Yes.
Westerners have always admired conquerors more than they ever admired statesmen, and so unless you are a hell of a statesman, you just don't make the cut. And Richard, being a great warrior, definitely makes the cut. And John is always going to look suspect in our eyes because of that. It's just the way it is. I mean, for instance, this isn't really the related dynasty, but Suleiman the Magnificent. We call him the Magnificent in the West because of his conquests, whereas the Turks call him the Lawgiver. It's a completely different perspective on how rulers should be.
Right. So Richard, back from the Third Crusade, ransomed from captivity, plundered his way through France, both through French territory and some of his rebellious vassals. Richard was killed in these adventures, and his brother John assumed the crown. His mismanagement of England, troubles with both northern barons and the papacy, allowed France to seize nearly all English territory on the continent, soon leaving him with only Gascony. This duchy, too, was threatened constantly, especially with England's continued conflicts with the Kingdom of Scotland, which was a valued ally of France. In 1328, Charles IV of France died, and when his wife gave birth to a girl, the Capet dynasty became extinct in the male line. 12 years prior, France determined that a woman could never hold the throne of France, and so the French had to look for the closest male relative to take the throne. This was a problem, as that happened to be Edward III of England. The French nobility and clergy decided that this right of inheritance originated through a woman, through Charles IV's sister, and was also invalid, and so, according to them, the nearest male relative would be Charles IV's first cousin Philip, the Count of Valois, and he was then crowned Philip VI of France, starting the Valois dynasty. In 1340, the Avignon papacy, notoriously pro-French for obvious reasons, confirmed the decision, and Edward III initially and reluctantly accepted and paid his due homage to the French king as his vassal, making concessions in some French name I can't pronounce, Guyane, but generally expected to be left alone as he prosecuted his war with the Kingdom of Scotland.
As long as you proceed it with ha-ha, you can say it anything. Exactly. You can mispronounce it, doesn't matter. You've done it correctly.
So Edward III also professed to reclaim and defend territory unjustly seized from his holdings. Edward III was further put on edge when a Scottish and French fleet sailed into the Channel, and after having abandoned a French plan to join the crusade that was going on. So the French king soon found an excuse to take more lands from the King of England. An exile from France was an advisor in the English court, and so Philip VI seized English territory in Gascony in 1337. This marked the start of the 100 Years' War in what was known as the Edwardian phase, which I said we would discuss, approximately 1337 to 1360. Several other proxy wars would span this period, such as the War of Breton Succession from 1341 to 1365, the Castilian Civil War 1351 to 1369, and the War of Two Peters from 1356 to 1374, or 1375, excuse me. These proxy wars will be covered in part 2, so we're not going to get too deep into the weeds on those because I have a whole nother part that I was going to cover them in, and they'll go in order. They're fairly, they're fairly they're fairly unnuanced. I mean, like, they're pretty straightforward. It's like, this was who France was allied with, this is who England was allied with, and this is what happened. They're not really that important. They just kind of shape what these little... they're proxy wars, like I said, and they shape minor interesting details of neighboring kingdoms. So I really wasn't super interested in them. If you are, when we talk about them and you feel like we didn't do them justice, I encourage you to research them yourself. The areas the French king seized from the King of England were profitable in the claret trade, which was significant to the English crown. The English relied on the local continental forces to hold out as they prepared to invade France, sending them neither money nor troops. Left them high and dry. The English forces under Oliver Ingham relied on their castles and defenses and held out valiantly, even convincing conflicted lords to join the English cause against the French. The English were desperate for money and troops and had begun to borrow heavily. French raiders, aided by Italian mercenaries, raided along the English coast, sacking, capturing, and burning several towns and settlements, notably Hastings, in an attempted attack on Kent. Eventually, the English demonstrated a show of force and sailed a fleet which essentially scared the French marauders back to the continent. The Italian mercenaries, angry over a dispute with the French, returned to Italy as well. England was now safe from the French on their own island for now. England was in need of something positive to show for now. To show for the war, which was created as he ceased his homage to the French king as his vassal. In 1339, he assembled an army in the Low Countries, where he had allies, and besieged Cambrai. Edward failed to take the city, but ravaged the countryside loyal to the French and won allies in all other territories. Several areas in Flanders rebelled against the French king, angry over their embargo of English goods. They remained neutral, but could trade with the English, which suited Edward perfectly fine. Ypres, Ghent, and Bruges proclaimed Edward King of France, and his war from 1340 onward would be an attempt to exercise his claim on the throne. So there you have it. That's pretty much the opening movements. The French seize what they consider to be their territory, the English fight back, and you have a lot of these vassals who seem kind of see an opportunistic, how would you say it? They have kind of this opportunistic gambit that they view the English as more advantageous to their financial interests mostly, and so they throw their weight either financially or militarily behind the English as opposed to the French.
Well, you have to also consider too that although he is the Duke of Normandy and King of England, he's not the King of France, even though he might claim that. And it's much easier for a nobleman, let's say you're the, Duke of Brittany, right? It's much easier to see the Duke of Normandy as an equal, as opposed to the King of France being an equal. Mm-hmm. So it's a good investment to go against the French crown, especially when the English have the upper hand.
Right, and that's important to note.
Spoiler alert, though, God is on France's side.
Indeed, in this war he is. His position strengthened, Edward III returned to England to deal with the deteriorating political situation and to arrange for better prosecution of the war. With the war with France unfolding on the continent, Scotland reclaimed significant portions of territory from the English, including Edinburgh Castle. In 1340, the French once again assembled a fleet and attempted to threaten England. Edward responded in kind with a fleet of converted mercenary ships. At the Battle of Sluys, the French fleet, bolstered with Castilian and Genoese ships, Genoese? You're the guy. Genoese ships, assumed a defensive formation. The English tricked the French into believing they were withdrawing, but wheeled and attacked with the wind and sun at their backs. The French were in too tight of formations, and the elements were against them. And the English soon routed the French and controlled the Channel for the rest of the war. Very much shades of the Royal Navy that we know and love during the Napoleonic War, right there. Despite this setback, Philip VI of France continued with his plans to continue war with what he viewed to be a rebellious vassal. This is a constant at least in this phase. And you'll see that, I believe, if memory serves, this idea that England is this rebellious vassal that needs to be put in their place is what eventually is basically the French view, and it adds to the humiliation of the early English victories, that the French are just being routinely defeated by people they think should be subservient, that owe them loyalty and allegiance. So it's very important to note that.
It's one of those disappointed but not surprised situations, though. Right? Like, the French kings could not have been so ridiculous as to honestly believe, as to be honestly incredulous of the notion that their vassals would not be as rebellious as they were. I mean, many of the rebels were in the French royal family, and towards the end of the war, the king who reigned in Joan of Arc, the Dauphin, Charles, I think it was the 7th, his son was extremely rebellious and did multiple rebellions against him, League of Public Weal and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's typical.
It is. I mean, it is. And that is something that we will get into in the third phase, I believe. Where did I leave off? Scotland. Yes, rebellious vassal, one who claimed the right to his own crown, no less. Philip VI assembled his army and attempted to smash the English allies in the Low Countries. It's another very common battleground. I think people...
Well, it's a very important one for England, because England has the wool trade in the Low Countries at this time period.
Correct.
It is probably one of the most important economic centers. I don't recall exactly when the Dukes of Burgundy acquired their property in the Low Countries, but it's around this time period, and it also makes the Duke of Burgundy very, very powerful in a way that it's a threat to the French crown.
I believe, if memory serves, that will be addressed in these articles in due course. So we'll see if they do. If not, it's a perfect note to keep in mind when we talk about the emergence of Burgundy, who plays a very, very, very important role in the 100 Years' War, really for both sides. Another little spoiler alert. England sent a pair of armies in the area to harass the French, but with one of these armies being almost totally destroyed early on, Edward III was the sole English force in the field. Besieging one of the largest cities in France, Toumai, which is now in present-day Belgium, Edward was rebuffed and failed to take the city before Philip arrived. Philip refused to meet the English in the field, opting instead to harass and shadow the army. The sides soon agreed to a truce, and the English again returned to England. Edward was hounded by vast debts that had far-reaching effects on Christendom, affecting many banks and towns when he defaulted on his debts. He was also facing outrage, as almost all of Scotland was back under Scottish rule, wrested from the English. So, a matter of national pride as well as national debt here. The truce lasts less than a year, and in 1341, the War of Britain's Succession reignited hostilities. As previously stated, the nuances of the war will be discussed next time. Suffice to say, another conflict arose around the inheritance of the Duke of Brittany, and the English and French both backed rival factions, causing fighting between the two kingdoms to resume, which would last about 2 years until the Avignon Cardinals created yet another truce. Despite this, the English would continue to support Brittany, eventually resulting in a victory in their side. In 1345, the war resumed in earnest, and the respite from war being necessary but brief. So, little spoiler alert. Hate to spoil, but it has to be addressed as to why there's a big gap. But now we see in July of 1345, this is where things get a lot more interesting, if you ask me. So I appreciate your patience. Basically, what's something that's worth saying and worth noting is that this war, it kind of starts off, it almost seems like not necessarily unserious, because I feel like that doesn't do it justice, but you see kind of like that older school idea of, can I pillage this town? Can I, you know, they don't really go into the massive pitched battles of before. They look more towards raiding. They look to besiegement, and when they have the options of pitched battles, they refuse to do it. So there really haven't been that many pitched battles, and war has been joined for around 6 years already. But that's all about to change. Josh, if you have any thoughts on that, just kind of like the nature of warfare in the early stages of the war, anything to add?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind, too, that through all of these things on both parties, there are families involved, and there are internecine fights between family members. Agincourt, which is coming up, is a perfect example, right? The King of England, I believe at the time, is allied with the Duke of Burgundy, or is soon to be. Several brothers of the Duke of Burgundy die in the Battle of Agincourt, fighting for the King of France, right? So you have brothers fighting, essentially brothers, in some aspects. You have family members striving and competing against each other, and the Dukes of Burgundy being another example. And they're very important in this war, and they are what the conclusion of what happens with Burgundy is perhaps maybe even the most important thing that comes out of the 100 Years' War after the initial fallout, so to speak. They are related to the crown. The first Duke of Burgundy is a son of a French king. They are cousins in these dynastic disputes going forward.
Right.
So it really is family versus family. It's not just it's another layer on top of the vassal versus king dynamic. There's also cousin versus cousin dynamic. It's very complicated.
And I would say that's interesting. You can see that there's almost the initial reluctance to do battle because of the relationship, like you said. But then, as you can see later in the American Civil War, the idea that wars between relatives truly are the bloodiest. And as you alluded to in the Battle of Agincourt, which I believe we won't even cover until that's in the final phase, so the 4th installment of the series that I wrote. We'll see how long this stream goes. We might be able to get to part 2 this, because I was planning to do about an hour. We seem to be going right along, and we can go a little longer if you're interested.
Yeah, well, the initial stages of the 100 Years' War are really, I don't wish to say irrelevant, because they, of course, will build up to what happens later, but they have very little impact on the conclusion.
I was going to say, I have a feeling the 4th article that I have is probably going to be the longest stream, and it's probably going to be a standalone. We might even be able to get through. We could probably do 1 and 2 on this stream, depending on how interested you are, how late you're willing to stay up. But like 1 and 2 would probably be done, because 2 is pretty straightforward. 3
right. So
again.
you really get like the 15th century, I feel like things don't start to have permanence,
right,
in a way that they did before.
Right.
Like, everyone can talk about the Battle of Poitiers and Crécy and Agincourt, but unfortunately, those battles, as impressive as they may have been, are historically not so significant in terms of final conclusions.
Correct. Ironically enough, though, that is exactly what we're going to talk about.
And we remember those battles more than other battles. But of course, the king who wins the war doesn't fight that way, as we'll find out.
Right. Okay. In July of 1345, Edward III once again sails for France with an army, this time with his son, also Edward, known as the Black Prince, which I originally had as the thumbnail for this video, so if it doesn't show up in the actual video itself, I'm sorry, but it should be the thumbnail.
I don't see it on the stream right now, but it was in the loading screen.
That's unfortunate. All right. Yes, Edward the Black, Prince of Wales. Philip VI again assembles a large force to face Edward and his son. The English marched towards the Low Countries once more, though did not hold any territory, merely pillaging as they went. Caen was ravaged, and other victories were won, such as Blanchetaque. Wow, I don't know. Another French-sounding name. This plundering and thank you. This plundering and the victories gave Edward much-needed wealth and sapped Philip of prestige. Edward could not However, Edward could not outmaneuver Philip forever. Eventually, Edward found a ford to the Somme and plundered the lands beyond. Philip and his mighty host finally caught up to him at the Battle of Crécy. Edward's army was made out of mostly English and Welsh footmen and archers with a comparatively small cavalry contingent. The English force did have knights from the Holy Roman Empire, but the French held a far larger contingent of armored knights. French host was vastly numerically superior to the English, but the English had the advantage of the terrain. Edward may have been the invader, but his plunder had forced Philip to take action against him. Edward's position was anchored to the west and east by towns and rivers. He had a sloped position, which would hamper the French cavalry. The English men-at-arms and much of their mounted troops were ordered to fight on foot and bolster the spear line in front of their vast longbow host. The English also dug ditches, spread caltrops, and otherwise fortified their positions. This battle would take place in the summer of 1336. The French began their attack by ordering their Genoese crossbow to advance on the English and thin their ranks. The Genoese were fatigued, and their weapons were generally inferior to the English longbow.
I don't mean to brag, but I have hired many a Genovese crossbowmen in my Total War days.
They're a pretty useful. They're a pretty useful force, but as we're about to see, not in this case. I don't know. How much do you know about the fate of the Genoese crossbows in this battle?
Enlighten us. I don't think I recall.
All right, here we go. So, as I said, the English longbow had a better rate of fire and better range. So, as arrows rained around them, the primitive English cannons thundered. The mercenaries, being the Genoese crossbowmen, panicked and began to retreat. The French nobility were disgusted by this turn and charged into the Genoese, hacking them down as they fled. A French count reportedly quipped, quote, "This is what one gets by employing such scoundrels who fail when there is any need of them." So basically they charged and killed their own men.
I wonder if they bled pesto.
It's a question one might ask the French nobility. This distraction and massing of forces provided ample targets for the longbowmen and the casualties of the French mounted. Successive charges were repulsed by the hail of arrows and fresh English troops who held strong positions. The blind John of Bohemia, an ally of Philip, demanded to engage the English. His bodyguard knights tied themselves to his saddle and went with him, expecting to make a brief engagement and return to French lines. John did not, however, and the force fought their way into the deep into the lines of the Black Prince. Declining to send his son any help, Edward stated, "Let the boy win his spurs." Win them he did, and the French were repelled once more. After the battle, the Black Prince observed the sorrowful body of John of Bohemia, still tethered to his loyal and noble knights who stayed with him to the end, all dead. It is a shining moment of chivalry in a battle that marked its decline. So that's the painting, that's the thumbnail, which if I can retroactively upload it, I will upload it to the background of the video. I don't know if I can, however. But that's part of the reason I included a detail of this battle. Like you said, Josh, ultimately it has little to do with the final outcome of the war, but it's important to note that in the early stages of this war and battles such as this, you had these instances of chivalry where you have people like John of Bohemia and his knights fighting to the very end, making these glorious but like doomed charges, whereas later in the war it becomes much more of a war of attrition, kind of a total war aspect. So
yeah, well, I think, you know, the 100 Years' War, I mean, everyone talks about the decline of chivalry and feudalism as being an outcome, and I think that's certainly true, but it's much more gradual, I think, than we're making it sound.
Well, that's true. It's not like by the end of the war that those things cease to exist, but by the end of the war, the status quo has changed in certain ways that it becomes, and I hate to use this term as a historian, it's not inevitable, but the groundwork, you're set on a path where the odds are stacked against you for that to change. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. Well, one of the reasons too is because what's coming up because of this time period is the Reformation, right?
Yes.
And during the Reformation, it completely changes the foundations of chivalry in many places, and we're going to see that significantly in Italy and in Germany, where it's completely changing that dynamic. You know, the old world is, and also with gunpowder. Gunpowder is another reason why chivalry starts dying out. In fact, in Orlando Furioso, which is about the peers of Charlemagne, and was written about, I think it's late 15th century. So not too far off. Orlando comes across essentially a gunner, a man wielding a gun or a cannon, and he so hates this infernal machine that he throws it into the ocean or something along those lines in the hopes that no one ever finds it and uses it ever again. Because, of course, what happens is the French are going to invade Italy, and they're going to bring with them cannons. So, I mean, gunpowder making its way, and, the last year of the 100 Years' War is 1453, and that's the fall of Constantinople, which is largely because of the Turkish use of gunpowder. So the whole way we do battle, or did battle, is going to completely change as a result of the 100 Years' War.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to see that. We talk about everyone talks about the longbows at Agincourt, but
we'll see about that.
One battle. No one's using longbows.
The longbows at Agincourt were not even that effective compared to these earlier battles. That's something I think I talk about in the later events, but certainly it's worth noting, like you said,
it's just the one battle, right? Like, no one's using longbows 100 years from now to drastically change the outcome of what's 100 years from then. The sack of Rome, right? It doesn't. It's not going to be some kind of innovation or anything like that. It's just the one battle.
What's worth noting too is how architecture of the defense changes due to the 100 Years' War. So the end of the 100 Years' War, you have this vast, and this is something we get into like in the nitty-gritty later, like I said, but something like in these earlier stages, there's these protracted sieges for months even. But towards the end, with Joan of Arc, you see all these castles falling by assault. Why? Because of artillery. So you see the decline of castles even as a viable defense.
Not only that, but also like the future's money, right? People don't talk about this enough. But with the rise of the nation state, that's what we're going to see at the end of the 100 Years' War. The future of the world is money. It's in financing, especially after the Black Death. And what Charles VII did especially, there's not a situation that he could solve with money that he didn't solve with money, because the French had some money, right? Or at least he did after Joan of Arc. I mean, he sold her out to the Burgundians,
right?
Right, and any situation that he could solve by buying his way out of, he did. He avoided conflict like the plague, and it worked very successfully because it was a new world. And his successor, Louis XI, was very successful at it too, and used money in all kinds of creative ways to defeat his opponent, who was the last Duke of Burgundy, or at least Duke of Burgundy actually holding Burgundy, not titular. And that's going to extend beyond as well, into the Italian Wars and into the things that happen afterwards, where money can literally make or break the geography in a way that it hadn't before. And, the landed knights are just nowhere near as important.
Correct.
Ever.
All right, let's continue reading, shall we?
Please.
All right, so only about a few hundred English fell in the Battle of Crécy, compared to tens of thousands of slain French, including a distressing amount of nobility. 2,200 heraldic coats were recovered by the English from the French dead. The battle marked a notable decline in chivalry, as highly trained nobles devoted to the code were cut to pieces by commoners who were relatively lightly trained. The French royal standard, the Oriflamme, was captured, and Philip VI had 2 horses killed from under him and took an arrow to the jaw, wounding him. The French force was shattered, and the English could march on to capture Calais in 1337. English forces in Scotland would also capture David II, the King of Scotland, in the Battle of Neville's Cross, and the threat of pressure on the English was likewise relaxed. In 1348, the Black Plague put the war on hold, and despite continued sporadic clashing in Brittany, such as the Battle of the 30, the war was essentially
Sorry to
put in.
interrupt, but it just occurred to me, since we're talking about the Scots and the Auld Alliance, another outcome of the war, and I know we're getting ahead of ourselves again, but in regards to Scotland, is that because England is removed from the continent, French interests in Scotland are not as prominent, are they? So it's possible that the removal of England from the continent isolates Scotland and makes it that much easier for England to kind of make it irrelevant in a way that it hadn't before, right? I mean, the Reformation's what ultimately nails the nail in the coffin of the Old Alliance, but that is only possible because of the 100 Years' War.
Yes, this is a good point, and that is something I don't address, so that is a very good point. Very good insight there. Philip VI dies in 1350, and it was succeeded by his son, Jean II of France, or John the Good. Very good, very, very wholesome nickname. In 1355, the English forces...
You don't get 16 of those, though.
Right. No, you don't. Well, the Good is what I mean. My first name is John, for those who don't know. That's why.
Right, and John the Good is going to be the father of Philip the Bold, who is going to be the first of the Dukes of Burgundy who really starts to establish his Middle Kingdom. Or try to establish his Middle Kingdom, I should say.
So, where were we? Okay, 1355. English forces were recovered from the plague enough to continue their campaigns against the French. The Black Prince conducted the typical English style of campaign, which was referred to as the chevauchée, which was to plunder what could be taken and destroy what could be not, discrediting the French king and transferring his wealth to England. So, essentially the precursors to the idea of total war. Edward was eventually cornered by John II. The Black Prince attempted to come to terms with John II, but John attacked on 19 September 1356 at the Battle of Poitiers. The English removed their baggage train from the battle. Huh?
I said ouch.
Yeah, exactly. The English removed their baggage train from the battle and caused the French to launch a hasty attack of about 300 knights, believing the English were fleeing. These men were nearly all killed. The longbowmen then began raining down arrows on the French infantry in the Dauphin of France's vanguard. Exhausted by a long march and now an arrow assault, Dauphin's forces were repelled by 2 hours of combat. This retreat caused a reinforcing force from the Duke of Orleans to retreat as well, and these two forces fell in with the king's advancing force. Thinking the battle was won, the Black Prince ordered his knights and men-at-arms to mount up and charge, sending a reserve force to hit the French in the flank and cut them off. The French were no longer retreating, but had reorganized and were advancing en masse towards the English, and were thus alarmed and surprised when the English host came crashing into them. English foot and archers soon joined the melee. The English flanking force completed the rout and reached the King John and his son Philip the Bold. Unable to locate the Black Prince, John yielded his gauntlet to the nearby English and exiled French knights, ending the battle with his captivity. John II's ransom was set at 2 million, but he demanded it be raised to 4 million, thinking that he was worth more, which the English were happy to agree. Just think on that for a second. You're the head of state, and they say, we want 2 million, we'll just say dollars. You're held captive. You're kidnapped. And your kidnappers tell your family, we want $2 million for your son. And you say, no, ask him for 4 million. You think your family's going to be happy? You think the French people were happy with that?
I don't think the French people, that is, the peasants or whomever, really cared or knew.
You think the nobility was happy about that? You think the French royal family was happy about that?
I don't think anyone was happy, but I think there was going to be unhappiness regardless, since you just got smashed and your king is captured. I mean, that
2 million
happened
to
too
4
often.
million. Come on.
Yeah,
I think
honestly,
it's
the way that the kings were able to come up with such sums is pretty astonishing to begin with, frankly.
Quite so. We're on the last paragraph, though. Then we can kind of go into either go into the second one or go into kind of a freelance style talk. It depends on what you want to do. The Dauphin Charles had to quell revolts throughout France, as the people of France were financially exhausted from taxes, disgruntled by English raids, and leaderless by the death and capture of thousands of French nobility by the English. French prisoners were given the chivalric freedom of movement during their assumed captivity, but when his sons erred in his parole, John II was honor-bound to return to captivity, which he did. That's a note. When you see a lot of the times in these battles, knights will yield up. Here's 2 notes I want to make. 1, throughout most of the Middle Ages, armor and like either shields or armor was good enough that most of the time there weren't very many casualties during the battle itself. However, once a force starts to retreat or flee, they lower their defenses, and so the pursuing army is able to kill more of them. That's why in most of the ancient and Middle Ages, or ancient times and medieval combat, you see most battles are fairly lopsided as far as casualties go. In addition to that, part of chivalry was if a knight yielded to you, you were pretty much honor-bound to accept, and you took him prisoner. If you were a knight, you were honor-bound, and if you were a commoner, you knew that he would be ransomed by his family, which would make you wealthy. So there were a lot of prisoners being taken. But another thing about the chivalric code was, most of the time, when a knight surrendered to you, the understanding was he would swear an oath based on the chivalric code that he would return he would basically go to his home to raise the funds and return with the money. So he was technically a quote-unquote prisoner in honor only. So it's kind of hard for us to fathom that we would say basically someone gives their word that they'll return to you, but this example shows that it was followed. The King of France gave his word that he would return, and when his sons started to renege on his parole, he went back to face physical captivity by the English. I think that's pretty telling. I don't know. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, the amount of trust that a lot of people had when it comes to prisons and things like that, back in those times, a little bit after, I think is pretty outside the scope of belief for most people around today. I remember hearing stories about different people who were imprisoned, who during the day were allowed to, basically freedom of movement. They just had to come to the prison to spend the night.
Right.
So they would go out and fete all around town, and then endure their captivity while they slept, while they were unconscious. So
that
really matter.
That actually persists in the Ancien regime of France, I believe, up until the French Revolution, for certain members of society.
During the Diamond Necklace affair, the cardinal who was responsible, or was part of the situation, he was imprisoned at the Bastille, and during the day, he had all kinds of visitors and all kinds of parties and fancy dinners that he would host. And in fact, after he was given his freedom, he went back to the Bastille to spend the night, just because he wanted to be sure he wasn't mugged on the way to his estate.
That the Marquis de Sade, a reprehensible figure, also had a similar experience while imprisoned prior to the French Revolution.
Would that they had strangled him in prison.
Yeah. Where did I go? Where did I leave off? Edward III attempted to...
I think that was the Cardinal de Rohan in the situation I just talked about, but I'm not sure.
Interesting. Last few sentences here. Here we go. Edward III attempted to seize Rheims and Paris while France was still in turmoil, but failed. As if by intervention of the Almighty God... I wrote this, by the way. So, just in case you were wondering, yes, I wrote this, and we did say that France was aided by God in this war. As if intervention by the Almighty God... I'm sorry?
It's Occam's razor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any simpler solution than God intervened in the 100 Years' War?
No.
I don't have a better explanation.
Well, he did. He sent Saint Joan of Arc. So.
Well, Saint Remigius, but I'm just talking about how often do you see those moments?
Right. True.
Right, in history.
Many such cases.
Kind of clear cut. Right. Like Joan of Arc really is an exception to the point where I don't know if you've read. I don't remember the author's name. But the 15 decisive battles. You know, the Battle of the Siege of Orleans is one of them. Right, and there is no figure in history like Joan of Arc. There just isn't. There's no moment in history that is just as inexplicable as the reversal of the 100 Years' War.
That's true.
Simply put, divine intervention is the only way to narrate the damn story.
Yeah. Well, we will get there. I promise you. Stay tuned. We are alluding heavily to this. And it will be, I promise you, it will be well worth it. Here we go. So, as if intervention by Almighty God, a storm smashed part of an English fleet, and hail, additionally, killed thousands of English soldiers and horses, forcing Edward to the negotiating table with the desperate French. Edward agreed to renounce his claim on the French throne in exchange for renewed sovereign rights to Calais and Aquitaine, reinstating the Angevin Empire. Thus ended the first period of the 100 Years' War, and despite not getting the French crown, the English had great territorial restorations, cementing them as the victors of this stage. All right, closing thoughts on that stage, and if you want, we can go on to the proxy wars to get that out of the way. If we want to just continue this some other time, but it's up to you. I'm good with whatever.
We can do the proxy wars, especially to get the overview, because as we mentioned before, there's a lot going on in Europe at the time.
Mm-hmm.
England in the ascendant. It's not going to last for very long. We're going to see. This is still not the status quo, but it is effectively, the geography is similar to the beginning of the war. The Angevin Empire of what effectively was before this time period, in the time of Henry II, Henry I, large holdings in France, in the Aquitaine, places like that, Normandy, Calais, whatever, and England versus the rest of France. And that pretty much is the geography that we have as we've concluded this time. And so now we're going to start to see a little bit further, but we're going to see it towards the end. That's completely done away with.
Right. And just to let you know, Josh, the proxy war one is a little shorter than what we just did, and the part 3, which is the Caroline phase, is only a page and a half. So we could probably even get through that because it can be summarized pretty quickly. So we could even, if this is just a little longer stream, we could devote a whole kind of longer stream to the 4th part, which is, as you and I have both said, is really what the meat and potatoes is. We just have to obviously give basically the whole part of the 100 Years' War is just background for this final phase, because that's really what the most important part of it is.
I mean, it is, because as we said, up until Agincourt and all those kinds of things, magnificent battles, but in the end, right, they don't amount to much.
Right. Because there's really no lasting thing. I mean, if essentially the 100 Years' War started with Henry V, that would really be the only thing you needed to know. Like, you could essentially write off everything else. Because,
if
like the name...
ended with Henry V, we'd live in a very different world.
Yeah. But like the name implies, it's 100 years. So with the gaps
I mean, effectively, look, put it in perspective. Dante died like 10 years before the start of the 100 Years' War, and the 100 Years' War ends the same year as the conquest of Constantinople.
Yeah.
Right? That's a big time period.
It's very...
We go from Guelph-Sibylline conflicts in Italy to effectively we're in the Renaissance at that time period then, right? Because, let's see, 1453, Medicis are effectively now players in Florence.
You want to know something interesting, though? The Reconquista is going on the entire time. It doesn't even end when the 100 Years' War ends.
Yeah, well, it doesn't seem so remote, too, because, the history of the Iberian Peninsula, although it's interrelated, like there are dynastic, for instance, the mother of Louis IX was Blanche of Castile, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are important dates in that history, but they don't really kind of relate too strongly in terms of the geography that we're dealing with, right? Like, the Second Crusade captured Lisbon, right? So Portugal kind of comes into its own a bit. And then, there's that one battle in the 13th century in Spain. And then, people don't really talk about Spain until Isabella and Ferdinand, do they?
Well, I do. It's the only other video on my channel.
Though, I mean, we have dynastic disputes between Leon and Castile.
Right.
Right, and Aragon.
Yeah.
But and although they have their impact in places like Sicily and Naples, right? That's not where the geography is centralized yet, right? That's just kind of like background flavor. Right now, at least for this time period, it's centralized in France, specifically. There is some action with Germany in the 13th century, and we're centralized in Papal States and that area. Some Venice, some around Genoa.
Right.
And then after the 100 Years' War, we're going to have Spain unite, become its own country, so it's going to become a player. It's going to unite with the Burgundian inheritance and the Holy Roman Empire, and that conflict is going to lead to the winner of this conflict, which is going to be France, and they're going to go head-to-head in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Aragonese influence in Sicily and Naples is going to be hugely important. And remember, France already has certain claims in Naples, right? And don't forget the Sicilian Vespers. So that all comes to a head after the 100 Years' War. But first, the 100 Years' War has to finish. We have to kick the English off the continent forever.
All right. Well, let's start with these proxy wars. So, wars in the interim, and this will roughly take place in 1341 to 1385. Now, this isn't strictly speaking part of the explicitly part of the 100 Years' War, because it's not generally, with one exception.
But
it doesn't really take.
It is relevant because all these things are relevant, but also in the context of the 100 Years' War, you also have the schism happening during all of this, right? I mean, that's a background that people don't really take into consideration, but it's really important because
essentially one papacy,
recognize different popes, right? And this is of course going to weaken the church significantly. I mean, we're leading up to the Reformation as well,
right? So the first up, we got the War of Breton Succession, which is from 1341 to 1361.
Sorry, one last thing.
Yeah.
Speaking of the Reformation, in the 100 Years' War, or during the time period of the 100 Years' War, we have Wycliffe active in England, and we have Jan Hus active in Bohemia.
Towards the end,
so
yes.
It's not just towards the end, but Wycliffe's a little bit early. Wycliffe, his patron was John of Gaunt, who is the father of Henry IV.
Kind of a shitbag.
Kind of a shitbag. So Wycliffe, at least, I mean, we're coming up on Wycliffe in terms of time. All that's going. Wycliffe is definitely a forerunner of the Reformation, and of course, what happens with Jan Hus is going to be very important as well. So it's not just the Reformation is coming up. We're almost effectively in some sort of proto Reformation concepts coming in, especially in relation to transubstantiation.
It is a big bridge. I know the Renaissance is more of a term for the culture rather than warfare. But especially with Jan Hus, like we said before, there is a major difference in warfare conducted by the Hussites versus the imperial forces and the textbook kind of chivalric confrontations that we see in the Middle Ages. The use of gunpowder is very heavy. The use of both static and elastic defensive strategies by the Hussites using war wagons is a big deal. So, and obviously commoners being more, both conscripts on the imperial side and basically just peasant rebellion as far as the Hussites go. You see a big change in the style of warfare, and in my opinion, it's a pseudo precursor to the 30 Years' War, the Wars of Religion, stuff like that. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, well, Westphalia is going to lay the groundwork for the notion of balance of power up until the Congress of Vienna.
Yes, and
which continues a similar concept.
What people don't realize is after the Treaty of Westphalia, one of the consequences that we don't even think about in the modern world as being interesting is that it essentially gave states the exclusive quote-unquote right to warfare. So mercenaries are still a factor, but you don't really have... The Treaty of Westphalia almost kills the idea of feudalism, because you no longer have dukes or other peers prosecuting wars on their own, because they're not the state. The state is the only one that can...
Well, that's going to come a little bit later, more specifically in the French Revolution with the levée en masse. Specifically, I mean, that's the first time we really start to see civilian armies.
Right.
The French Revolution, which is just a natural evolution from the New Model Army of Cromwell and Gustavus Adolphus's professional armies, and before that you had after that.
Well, the Prussians also had a
they did that, but those were still those were professional armies, yes, but they weren't armies of the people. In the French Revolution, of course, we'll see with the Committee of Public Safety, they really take us to new heights of centralization, and that is the narrative too of the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War ends it doesn't end it, but it certainly is the death knell of a more decentralized Europe. And so we're going to see at the end of the 100 Years' War, we're going to see a strong France and a strong England centralized in their own spheres. Germany won't happen for a long, long time. And so you'll also see Spain, although it's very decentralized, it has a strong leader who's able to get what he needs. Of course, Spain will have its difficulties with that later with the Corteses of the different Castile and Aragon, but we are seeing more centralized powers. We're starting to see nation states develop, and Westphalia is going to cement that inexorably.
All right. Well, we'll get into the interim wars then. This is obviously, like we said, this is all after this, so we gotta lay the groundwork. The big takeaway before I start, basically what we're saying is the 100 Years' War is almost imperative to understand. This is like the background of modernity. I guess is like the best way we can say it. Like, this leads to the other things which creates the world we know today.
It's the origin of the world we know today. It is starting to establish the boundaries that we will understand to develop the Europe that we know today.
Right. It's the rock that starts the avalanche, if you will.
Yeah, it is the beginning of that slippery slope.
All right, it's the War of Breton Succession. Arthur II, the Duke of Brittany, had children from 2 marriages, and a son named John from each. John III, the Duke of Brittany, and John, Count of Montfort. I say this because it might get a little confusing, so bear with us. John III, that is the Duke of Brittany, had no children, but hated his half-siblings and sought to have them bastardized. He attempted to have his niece made his heir, and she married Charles of Blois, the nephew of Philip VI of France. However, John III reconciled with John Montfort, but on his deathbed refused to finalize and settle the matter. Charles of Blois and John of Montfort were thus in competition for the duchy. Charles had the support of the king and the nobility, but John acted quickly and seized Nantes, the seat of the duchy, and almost all the other cities. As Philip backed Charles, John Montfort proclaimed Edward III King of France. Despite how helpful this might have been, Edward III could not help John during the truces during the Edwardian phase, which we have just talked about, and during these, Philip and Charles captured John once they defeated him in battle. England eventually lent their support to the cause, and France and England clashed within the duchy itself. However, in the fear that Edward would invade somewhere else in France, Philip withdrew the French army. Charles succeeded without him, however, and Montfort's support crumbled. England managed Montfort's territories for him while he was in prison, and his wife was racked with insanity. I did not remember that. His son, also named John, was named heir to Brittany. England sent troops to aid the cause. Though initially successful, they encountered many shortcomings and withdrew to support Edward's landings in Normandy. Charles was unpopular due to his massacring of citizens of an English-held town and lost French supports after their defeats in Crécy and Calais. Breton traders demanded strengthened ties to English merchants. Charles was eventually captured, trying to retake an English-controlled town in 1347, spending 5 years in the Tower of London itself. During this time, as the English and Montfort cause advanced, occurred the Battle of 30. 30 knights on each side of the conflict agreed to a duel to settle a dispute between their respective territories. Those supporting Charles of Blois triumphed, killing 9 of their foes to 6 of their own losses. It is considered a shining example of chivalry and is highly romanticized. So once again, in this early stages of the 100 Years' War, we see this very chivalric thing where 30 knights get together and fight kind of a crypto tournament against one another. And they basically resolve the thing, saving hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. Just an interesting little anecdote there. England agreed to free Charles to be duke as long as the duchy pledged loyalty to England. This was cemented with the marriage of John Montfort the Younger to Edward's daughter Mary. This was overseen by a papal dispensation and the Constable of France. The latter was assassinated by Charles II of Navarre, an ally of England, who needed the war to keep his power. He then defected to France to gain territory and voided the treaty. Charles was still free and still the Duke. When 22, John returned to Brittany with the majority of the territory, though Charles had the title. They attempted to come to terms, but Charles attacked. John eventually triumphed and Charles was killed, ending with, ultimately, a Montfort victory. However, despite all this drama, and this is the final sentence, this is basically how it ends. Despite all that drama, John of Montfort, who was originally an English subject, does not even ally with England, even though the English backed him. After he wins the title of the Duke of Brittany, he allies with France anyway. And that's the story of Breton succession. I know it's really confusing. Really, the big takeaway is the Battle of 30. So, if you have
the Bretons are very crafty. I mean, they're one of the last holdouts, really, that can manage to be relatively independent. Right? Brittany doesn't really get absorbed into the French crown until, I think, Francis I, which is early to mid 16th century. Right? So that's a pretty good holdout for a little duchy. I say little, but for a duchy. I mean, very few dukes could say the same.
One thing of note, too, they are somewhat ethnically different from most. They are less Germanic than
Well, they're Celtic.
Yeah, they are more Celtic and less Germanic than the rest of France. But let us continue. The Castilian Civil War and the War of Two Peters, from 1356 to 1369. So, in 1350, King Alfonso the 11th died, and I think that's of Castile. And he was succeeded by Peter, known alternatively as the Just and the Cruel, which is very interesting. Alfonso's illegitimate son Henry then tried to take the throne as well, and was supported by France, Aragon, and the papacy. In the grand scheme of things, these wars were quite inconsequential to the 100 Years' War itself. Peter of Castile found allies in England with the Black Prince, and Henry of Castile, Peter of Aragon, both found a stalwart ally. Wait, hold on. Where did I go? Peter of Castile found allies in Edward, the Black Prince of England, and Peter of Castile found allies in Edward of England. Henry of Castile and Peter of Aragon both found allies in France. Peter of
Gaunt married to a Castilian princess?
Huh?
John of Gaunt, wasn't he married to a Castilian princess? I can't remember.
I can't remember either. We'll see if I write about it or not, but this one is only like a couple paragraphs long. I'm just gonna slog through it because it's like I'm just gonna try and find where's the takeaway. You know what I mean? Blah blah blah.
Takeaway is we're still waiting for Ferdinand and Isabella.
Right. But if you watch my other video, you will find them. So there's another shameless plug. Peter of Castile would not.
I wish you would have let me know that you're doing the Reconquista, because I just posted the story about Boabdil.
I put it on Twitter and I told people that I was doing it. However,
but I had just shared that anecdote where he was crying. There's a place outside the city of Granada where they say where he cried. He was crying at the loss of his city, and his mother said to him something along the lines of, "It's good that you cry for the city as a boy, because you couldn't hold it as a man."
Oh yeah, I do remember that. Yeah, definitely watch the video, Josh. I'm sure you will enjoy it. I've gotten very flattering reviews of it, to be honest. It doesn't have very many views, but some of the people that watched it, they give very flattering remarks, so I do appreciate that, if you're listening.
Loyal mutuals out there.
Loyal mutuals. I love my mutuals. I have the best followers. Simply the best.
I have better followers.
Well, I don't know about that. Okay. Peter of Castile... Huh? What?
At least 3 times better.
Peter of Castile would not honor his promises to England, and so their backing would be revoked. France would continue to support their allies, but ultimately the War of Two Peters would prove to be inconclusive as far as territory. The Castilian Civil War, however, would be more significant. Despite England's continuous victories over the French and French-backed forces, the Black Prince could not kill or capture Henry, and when Peter of Castile betrayed him, he abandoned the campaign, leaving France to eventually prevail. Peter and Edward had surprised Henry's army in 1367 at the Battle of Nájera and slain most of them, capturing many nobles other than Henry, despite a ferocious and brave charge and delaying action by French free companions and Henry's vanguard. Despite the crushing defeat, the battle proved Henry's tenacity and resilience, and his supporters were ransomed to face Peter once again. Peter would fail to honor his promises to Edward, as we said before, who faced financial and logistical ruin for his campaigns. This battle essentially ended the Black Prince's military career, and he soon died in 1376. Henry would kill Peter the Cruel, unloved by many and unsupported by England. In the year 1369, Henry's forces stormed the holdings of Peter, with Henry killing Peter, crowning himself Henry II of Castile. He cemented his authority by formally allying with Charles V of France and expelling the Jews from all high offices. Wow, I don't know why I put that in there, but okay. Oh boy. Optics check. France had once again triumphed in the proxy wars, despite their utter failure in the Edwardian phase of the 100 Years' War. This conflict is also interesting anecdotally as to why... Oh, here we go. This conflict is an interesting anecdote as to why the Reconquista dragged on for so many years. The Iberian Peninsula had Christian kingdoms constantly fighting one another rather than focusing on expelling Islam. However, the victories of France in these proxy wars were crucial in their survival, as the success of English allies on the continent would greatly threaten France, and the death of the Black Prince was a major relief to the beleaguered French. So there you go. That's why I put it in there, because it's a reference to my other video, where I talk about there's a huge gap. There's a huge gap in the territorial gain made by the Christians, like basically with El Cid and later, obviously, Ferdinand and Isabella. But this is part of those reasons, the big factional infighting and basically these wars of succession amongst the Spanish crowns.
Yep.
All right. With that, the last one. Now, this is the Portuguese Civil War, which is the last proxy war. This one is a shout out to Knight of Atlantic. He posted about this, and I completely forgot about this. I initially thought that when he first started his like mini thread, I thought he was talking about the Castilian succession that led to Isabella taking the throne of Castile. So I wasn't unsure, because he's Portuguese. I was unsure as to why he was posting it. But he was posting about this Portuguese Civil War, which is very flat. It's a very flattering war as far as Portuguese nationality goes. So yeah, a big shout out to him. I apologize. I was a bit snotty in my Twitter remarks to him over it. But yeah, this is a source of pride for Portugal, and it's a very, very interesting, historically speaking, especially when you consider England's involvement and the subsequent relations that the Anglo-Portuguese have after this war.
It's one of the oldest alliances in the world.
Exactly, and this is where it originates. So, this war, like the Castilian Civil War, is far more significant in explaining the length of the Reconquista than actually having a genuine impact on the outcome of the 100 Years' War. Despite this, the war itself was part of the Anglo-French conflict and thus must be noted in the examination of the broader 100 Years' War conflict. Once again, the French and English backed opposite sides in a matter of succession. The English backed John of Portugal, and the French backed John of Castile. The Kingdom of Portugal would go to the crown of Castile to a political marriage to the late King of Portugal's daughter and a lack of true-born male heirs. This suited the French, but was something the English could not abide. In late May of 1385, Castile had sent raiders to Portugal, who plundered and pillaged, aided by French cavalry. Their atrocities being unwelcome, Portugal sent a contingent to stop them, and did so, releasing their prisoners but recapturing the loot of the Castilians. Thwarted, John and Castile sent a much larger force to press the claim in Portugal, but was again defeated. The battle, in late 1385, known as something very Portuguese that I'm not going to try and pronounce, Albertao, I don't know, was a blend of what happened in the 100 Years' War and what had happened in the 100 Years' War and what was to come. The Portuguese were heavily outnumbered, almost 5-1, but used the terrain and pre-made defenses to their immense advantage, as the English had at Cressy, Poitiers, and would again at Agincourt. The English had a contingent of forces with the Portuguese, including some 100 longbowmen. The Castilians had a force of French cavalry as well, bolstering their forces. The vast Castilian numbers had to squeeze together to face the Portuguese as a pair of creeks guarded the Portuguese flanks. The French cavalry thundered forward to shock the Portuguese lines for the main assault, but as at Cressy, the pre-made defenses and archers shattered this attack, and many knights were taken prisoner and taken to the Portuguese rear before the Castilian main body could arrive. This attack was likewise hindered by terrain, defenses, and archers, but reached the Portuguese line nevertheless, with their cavalry pressing the Portuguese flanks. With no troops that could be spared to guard them, John of Portugal ordered his prisoners executed, a foreshadowing of later events in the 100 Years' War at Agincourt. The battle going ill, it was exacerbated by the death of the royal Castilian standard-bearer. Thinking their king dead, the already weary Castilians began to rout. They were slaughtered by the pursuing Portuguese, and some 5,000 would be killed by Portuguese locals alone. John of Castile had to flee for his life, leaving behind noble and commoner. This war would not officially end until 1411, and the matter was decided after this battle, but the English had prevailed in preventing the French from greatly strengthening an ally, and the Treaty of Windsor created the oldest still active military alliance, as you said, the one between England and Portugal. Portugal's independence was greatly celebrated and commemorated, and their dynastic successors would earn fame, such as Henry the Navigator, the royal prince who sponsored expeditions to Africa, sparking the age of exploration, and catapulting Portugal as a global power in trade and colonies. That is the end of the second phase. Thoughts, comments, feelings, reactions?
No, I think we have, with the proxy war specifically, we explained what was going on. I think we both agreed that events in Spain were not too monumental outside of themselves, perhaps with the exception of Portugal. As you mentioned, the end of that Portuguese war, 1411? Mm-hmm. So we are coming up on their little age of discovery. Soon, Vasco da Gama and men like him are going to undertake their voyages. You mentioned Henry the Navigator, who I'm confident is a direct descendant of John of Gaunt as well. So we're seeing that in play as well. Portugal, with the Treaty of Tordesillas, is going to kind of do its own thing in contrast to Spain. So it'll be in India, other parts of Southeast Asia, and that'll eventually lead to places like Japan, whereas the Spanish are going to be more focused towards the Americas. So I don't think it has any strong relevance to the foreground, which is the 100 Years' War.
Right.
And of course, what's going to happen in Italy afterward.
Italy, Spain, these are all affected. Yeah. 100 Years' War, less consequential. So,
like 100 Years' War is much more focused in, in France itself.
Right.
So we're kind of removed from it. But as we mentioned before, during all of this with the schism in mind as well, right? Spain and Portugal are backing their different popes. I don't remember which side is backing. I'm fairly confident that Castile and Portugal might be backing different popes.
Correct. Castile was backed by the Avignon papacy, and Portugal backed the Roman candidate. What we would consider the Orthodox line of succession.
Castile and Leon and Aragon are both backing Avignon.
Correct.
And Portugal's backing Rome.
Correct.
In contrast to, France is backing Avignon, of course, and England is backing Rome.
Right. That's, in my opinion, that's what leads to England's ultimate success in these periods, is they backed the true line of succession in Peter. However, when that issue is resolved, you can see once again that France is favored by the Almighty and leads to their eventual victory.
Yeah. For the average person, right, where the Pope isn't so important.
Right.
You're just a peasant in Castile.
Where he isn't important. No.
You happen to, let's say, walk into Poland, you'd still go to Mass, and there'd be no major issue.
Right. Well, this does bring us to the technically part 3, as I put it. It's the Caroline phase from 1369 to 1389. And this is one I can kind of read fairly straightforward, but again, do feel free and be pleased to jump in. But this is, like I said, it's only a page and a half worth of material. The only reason
this is the time period where the conflict between France and Burgundy, especially and specifically, is going to come a bit of a head.
I believe so, but we will see. I can't
When is John the Fearless assassinated? 1419. Okay, so we're not quite there, but it's starting to.
Right. All right, so this phase of the 100 Years' War is arguably the most straightforward and simple of the all phases, and is easily the shortest. After the failure of the French monarchy during the Edwardian phase of the 100 Years' War, the Treaty of Bretagne, which was negotiated, and the English renounced their claim to the French throne. The French returned English continental territories to sovereignty under the English crown. Just a little recap. In the truce period of the war, the English and French continued to prosecute their action in the proxy wars we have just discussed. Following the failure of Peter of Castile to remunerate the Black Prince, he withdrew, financially ruined and logistically exhausted, and personally ill, leading to his death. Blah, blah, blah. He increased the taxes on his continental holdings, especially Aquitaine, and enraged, they actually appealed to France and tried to give France their loyalty again. So Charles V at first felt there was nothing he could do about this situation, the Treaty of Bretigny having tied his hands. However, upon reflection, Charles V determined that the renunciation of the French crown by Edward III was imperfect, and nullified the treaty, and so Charles V realized he did in fact have authority over Aquitaine. It was a really interesting thing. He basically just said, fuck it. In realizing this, he summoned the Black Prince of Wales to Paris and to answer the complaints of his vassals. Due to being ill and unwilling to agree with the French interpretation of the treaty, the Black Prince refused. This was all Charles V, known as the Wise, needed, and he resumed France's war against England. Charles V's secret weapon in the war was the Great Britain commander, Bertrand du Guesclin, which, if you are familiar with the Nine Worthies... Are you familiar with the Nine Worthies, Joshua?
I am familiar with the Nine Worthies.
Can you name them?
In fact, one of them is going to come up shortly.
Really?
Lair.
Who?
Lair.
What are you
fought
talking?
with Joan of Arc.
No, Lahir is not one of them.
I'm sorry. No, he's not a worthy. I was thinking of playing cards.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, I know the Nine Worthies. There's 3 times 3. There's 3 Hebrew worthies. There is 3 ancient Christian worthies.
3 pagan, 3 Jewish, 3 Christian.
3 pagan, 3 Hebrew, and 3 Christian.
So there's Hector of Troy, Alexander the Great,
Hector, Troy, Alexander, and
Julius Caesar.
Caesar.
Then there's Judas Maccabee, Joshua, and King David. And then King Arthur.
King Arthur,
Charlemagne, and the Crusader, what's his name?
Godfrey of Bouillon.
Godfrey de Bouillon. Well, interesting.
Yeah, sorry, I was thinking of playing cards because one of the playing cards faces is Lair.
No worries. Now, interestingly enough, the Nine Worthies were made before the 100 Years' War, the book basically which named them, and so they named a 10th worthy, and the 10th, quote-unquote 10th worthy is Bertrand du Guesclin, who we're talking about now. So he's the French... Okay. He's the French...
You know they had 9 female worthies as well?
Yeah, I don't remember them off the top of my head, though. They're very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't recognize many of the names myself. I felt kind of silly.
Yeah.
When I looked at the names, I was like, who are these ladies?
Yeah. It'd be interesting to look up. I would be interested to look that up. But anyway, Du Guesclin had fought for Charles of Blois in the Brittany conflict and had been ransomed by the French king after his daring feats of chivalry in service to the crown. With Brittany pledged to France after the war, Du Guesclin could serve the king. He served well in Castile for Charles V, aiding Henry in avenging Charles V's sister-in-law, whom Peter of Castile had poisoned. Despite being captured again by the Black Prince, Charles V once again ransomed him, thinking him too valuable an asset, which is true. He was a great commander. Besides, Du Guesclin had done his job well and bloodied the English enough that they withdrew, leading the French to eventual victory. Du Guesclin pretended to accept a bribe. This is an interesting story. Du Guesclin pretended to accept a bribe from Peter to allow him to escape, but was promised more money by Henry, leading to a duel between the two at Henry's behest. This is how Peter dies, by the way. At first not indicating who he served, when Pedro, that is Peter, gained an advantage, Du Guesclin quipped, "I neither put nor remove a king, but I help my master," and physically turned Pedro over during the grapple, allowing Henry to stab him to death. His reward of land and title sealed a Castilian-French alliance. In 1370, Charles V recalled him and named him the Constable of France. So just an interesting anecdote. This guy's This guy's kind of a badass. I'm just throwing that out there. Charles V angered many nobles by his choice to make Du Guesclin constable, as he was seen as quote-unquote too low-born for the position. But he soon proved himself to be a capable and excellent commander, particularly when using Fabian tactics, which, I don't know if you're familiar with Fabian tactics. That's essentially the idea of scorched earth policies.
No, I'm not.
Huh? I beg your pardon?
I said no, I'm not familiar with Fabian tactics.
So, scorched earth, or if you know anything about the French invasion of Russia during the Napoleonic conflict, the Russians used Fabian tactics.
Right. I'm familiar with that.
So burning Moscow, burning supplies, that's what Du Guesclin would use against the English. So he avoided them in open battle, managing to capture town after town, and English commander after English commander. Charles V, unlike Du Guesclin, considered... okay, interesting. Charles V, unlike Du Guesclin, considered chivalry to be outdated and was content to leave English leaders in prison rather than ransom or parole them. The English were thus running short on commanders, and the Black Prince and Edward both perished soon after this phase of the war began. So they perished shortly after it began, but prior to that were physically unable to participate due to their age or illness. In December 1370, Du Guesclin met with the English in a pitched battle at Pont-Valaine. Du Guesclin executed several forced marches and surprised the English, killing them almost to a man. Other English forces who had taken refuge in chateaus were likewise killed or captured. The English situation was greatly exacerbated by the decisive defeat at La Rochelle, in 1373, which La Rochelle, my opinion, a fantastic painting. This is again later on.
With the Cardinal Richelieu?
Cardinal Richelieu. Great. That's how when I looked back at this, when I was preparing this live stream, I saw that and I was like, wow, La Rochelle. That was the strong point of, what were they called? The Huguenots?
Yeah, the Huguenots.
The Huguenots.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, it wasn't the strong point. Well, back in the Wars of Religion, it was one of the major cities in terms of strongholds. But after the death of Henry IV, and during the reign of Louis XIII, and the oversight of Cardinal Richelieu, that was the last stronghold. England and the Duke of Buckingham, who was the favorite of Charles I, had tried some business with La Rochelle, but Richelieu wasn't having that, and he broke the Huguenot power.
The Red Eminence.
And of course, after Louis XIV became king, he revoked the Edict of
Nantes.
I think it's the Edict of Nantes, yeah.
Yes, it was the Edict of Nantes. Yes.
I get that one in Fontainebleau.
Another great historical event that you guys should all look up on your own. This is a fascinating point in history, but I digress.
Yeah, we are coming to because of the 100 Years' War. It leads into that.
Oh,
right?
for sure.
We're talking about Wycliffe and the Reformation, right? Wycliffe leads into Calvin, who comes from France, and Calvin's ideas are going to take hold with a lot of the French nobility. And the French Wars of Religion is going to be the battleground in a way that a lot of the other places, they were already decided, right? Like Scotland was already Protestant. England was just, Italy was just going to be Catholic, right? And France was kind of like this middle ground along with a couple other places. And France is really where the Counter-Reformation really went out big. But this is all things we're leading up to because of what's going on in the 100 Years' War. We have Wycliffe under John of Gaunt, who is saying his very heretical thing. You have Jan Hus over in Bohemia. The schism is weakening the church. And even though the Council of Florence, which still occurs within the time of the Hundred Years' War, does lead to a solidification of some doctrine, and it's certainly an important council, even if the Eastern Orthodox retracted, so to speak, their positions. It is significant, and it's going to lead us right into the Reformation, so that none of this is insignificant in what's coming up next with what that very thing you're talking about with La Rochelle and the wars of religion, especially. And those are played into too, because the French influence in the Italian war is going to play a big part. Catherine de' Medici was I think she was the daughter of Giovanni della Bandinere, of the Black Bands, which is a badass name. And it was Clement VII, who was the Pope during the sack of Rome in 1527. He was a Medici, and he's going to establish this little marriage between Catherine de' Medici and Henry II? Yes, Henry II, while Francis I is king at Marseille, I believe, is where they get married. I was in Marseille, so I got to see the Chateau d'If, which is where they had originally stopped before they landed into the harbor proper. You can see the Chateau d'If from the port of Marseille. It's right there. And of course, that is going to be a big moment in terms of the history of France. Catherine de' Medici was the mother of, 3 kings? So all of these things are related.
Yes. We shall continue then. Continue with this. As you said, they're all related, so it's best if we give a...
I felt like we were going in circles there for a second, but I came to the point.
Yes, quite so. I just got to figure out where we are. So... The English situation... Yes, the English situation was greatly exacerbated by the decisive Battle of La Rochelle in 1373, a naval battle in the Bay of Biscay, where a French and Castilian fleet met the English fleet and wiped them out. Many of the English drowned or were burned alive during the combat, though a great many knights and common soldiers were captured. A large sum of money was also captured to the benefit of the French and the expense of the English. The English trade routes were greatly afflicted, and they continued to lose territory on the continent. Du Guesclin defeated another English army in the same year at Chizay, and the English situation was dire. Their holdings on the continent severely lessened. Even the English hero John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, failed to win victories in France, and his armies were ambushed and defeated. The English were more than willing to come to the negotiating table under the appeal of the Pope in 1375. These negotiations were hampered by the Prince of Wales' death in 1376, and his father, the King of England's death in 1377. Again, the negotiations broke down over the sovereignty of Aquitaine, so no truce was met, and war resumed. In 1378, the French support of the Avignon papacy led to a great schism which would not be resolved for over half a century. The papacy could not be counted on to end the war. Both Du Guesclin and Charles V died in 1380, leaving Charles VI, alternately called the Beloved and later the Mad King of France, even though he was only...
I thought he was made of glass.
Yeah. Very interesting fellow. This was not a significant turn of events, as England was now being, quote-unquote, ruled by a young Richard II. Both countries essentially were ruled by only advisors for the time being. France had some internal struggles due to taxation, but was gradually worked out. The two young kings eventually worked a truce in 1389, ending this stage of the 100 Years' War with a decisive French victory. The French dominated this stage from beginning to end, their people more motivated, resources greater, and their commanders more skilled, and their technology had improved. And this is where I had referenced this before. French armor was now more effective against the longbow and allowed the French to ride down the English in battle. French sent confident in their victory, but the peace would not last in Charles VI's lifetime. only Richard III, or only Richard II would not see the war resume. He would be killed and usurped before he could see the prosecution of the later conflict. And there you have it. That's the end of the third. And the last one, as I said, is a stream unto itself, as it's what we've been alluding to, the Lancastrian phase. So that's all the content I have.
Things are actually going to start to matter now. As we speak.
I'm sorry?
Things are actually going to start being much more meaningful.
Things are going to start to matter. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. What we've said basically up to this point, like, except for the intermediate wars that were of consequence to the Reconquista, they don't really matter for the 100 Years' War, because the 100 Years' War is essentially decided in this last phase. Because, as we said, and rightfully so, like, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the Black Prince. But, really, more people have heard of Henry V and Agincourt and Joan of Arc. Like, those two names alone essentially define the 100 Years' War.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I mean, we've been at this for about an hour 40. I've basically exhausted the content that I had pre-prepared. If you want to talk about anything else, you know, if you want to, like, again, kind of tell the audience where this is going, why it matters, feel free. But
I think we've touched on most of the things of why it matters. You know, I mean, it has very long-term implications. That's why we mentioned before why it was so monumental. We've already seen before the war starts with, as we mentioned Dante earlier, we're in the time of Petrarch. We're in the birth of the Rinascimento. We are in the twilight of the Middle Ages as we know them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's much less clear-cut than that in all reality, but we have to make distinctions somewhere when we talk about history. So we're seeing a new Europe rise up, and so this transition from a French-English struggle into the French-Spanish/Holy Roman Imperial struggle is what we're building up for. It's what we're transitioning into. And of course, that will end with what looks like Habsburg dominance, but in fact will end in French dominance after Westphalia. France becomes the dominant power on the continent and will remain so effectively until the unification of Germany.
Yes. And one thing I would also like to note, apart from its fame, the 100 Years' War almost stands as an anomaly, more or less.
What does?
The 100 Years' War, as far as in the medieval period, where you have two, wars in Christendom were fairly rare. I think you can agree with that.
If you're the average peasant in the Middle Ages,
right. Between two Christian kingdoms from what we would look as the onset of the Middle Ages through to the wars of religion, two Catholic kingdoms, the wars between them aren't really prolonged. They're not very violent. They're you know what I mean. Like they just weren't.
No, they're
common.
Not, they're not. And we don't see that really in the 100 Years' War either, but they're not total wars, right? There's no unconditional surrender as we understand it with, let's say, something like World War II or the American Civil War, right? There are usually well-defined goals, even if they're just to make money, right? Like when Edward IV landed in, I think it was Normandy, to threaten Louis XI, he didn't intend to gain territories. He just wanted to take a bribe to go back home to England,
Right.
He had more important things to do, but he had alliances with the Burgundians he had to honor. So he landed some troops on the coast of France so that he could get paid and go home. And that effectively is a lot of how warfare is in the Middle Ages. We have our eyes set on maybe like one town, right? Or we have a conflict over this, and we're going to solve it by releasing, like for instance, Louis the Louis the Ninth, generally conceded some territory to meet his goals for peace.
And that was, like you said, that's the precedent set by the Vikings with the idea of the Danegeld, the idea that we're not really after conquest, we're not really after territory, we're not even looking for a battle. If you want to bribe us, like, we're not above a bribe. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of the prevailing attitude. And like I said, that's
they're
almost
just not centralized enough to have those kinds of wars,
right,
where we're going to wage war for very, I guess, distinct overarching goals, right? Usually the goals are much more material than total victory.
Right.
In fact, the idea of total victory really isn't a thing.
Right. That is exactly the point. I think, like we said before, like our modern lens almost can't comprehend that idea that people weren't really interested in that. They weren't, these kings, these princes, the prosecutors of the wars, the idea of unconditional surrender, it kind of happened in the Civil War, but the American Civil War, but it doesn't really pervade on an international scale until World War II.
And even in this time period that we're talking about, the average soldier is not some peasant who got conscripted. It is typically a mercenary or someone who is
a man at arms.
I mean, the word brigade comes from brigand.
Yeah.
Right? And it comes from this time period. So the concept we have of civilian army doesn't exist. It doesn't come until several centuries afterwards with the Revolution. We still have mercenary armies. We have knights who are required to do a number of days to fight for the king as a requirement. But we're not conscripting majority of people into a war footing, so to speak. In fact, the old notion of a country at war, a war footing, doesn't exist yet.
Right. Right. That's another important note. It's just
no one's planning victory gardens.
Right. Well, I feel like that's a pretty good place to leave it off. A good lead into the last stream. Which, do you want to join for the last one? I feel like this went pretty well. I enjoyed kind of the.
I might as well see the 100 years worth.
Yeah. So you and I will work it out. Either over text or through Twitter when we want to do it, what day works for us. But now that I kind of figure out I don't remember exactly what I did to get this damn live stream up, but I have kind of an idea of how to do it, so hopefully it won't be so...
we can conscript Turbo if we have to.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll see if we can do it over a day that we both have off, so I know the 11 o'clock start probably isn't the best for like live viewership, so... yeah, we can try and figure it out. Figure out a day that works for both of us and do this. And maybe devote a good, hour and a half to this last phase.
Probably a little bit longer because we want to focus more on really kind of seeing things through completely, right? Like, we can look at the result of whatever it is 100 years later.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the consequences are that long term.
Right.
As I said, it is significant... because it changes the dynamic all the way up to the French Revolution. That's 1789, right? So it's a long period of time to have its influence felt significantly.
Excuse me. Yeah, I completely agree. So, yeah, we'll do this kind of the same format. I'll work through what I have written. We'll stop the talk, and then after we're done, we'll kind of analyze the so what, if you will. Like the where does that leave us? What happens after that? So... if you don't, if you're just watching this, I used to hate when people did this, but now I found myself doing this. Like and subscribe if you want. follow us on Twitter. Obviously, my Twitter handle is the same. It's just Vassal of Christ. I can't remember yours off the top of my head, but...
Just remember the Regina Caeli, Oro pro nobis Deum.
Yep. So follow Josh as well. That's all we got for you now. Feel free to stay tuned, like, comment, subscribe, etc., and so forth. I'm less concerned about this YouTube channel than I am about Twitter, so just let me know on Twitter, pretty much. But with that, I'm going to turn up the music that I have playing in the background, let it play us out. So here you go.